The answer, are we still a classless society, Mr. Cameron? No. But there again, we never were. It's just that it's more apparent now, partly in the form of Mr. Cameron himself, who we haven't had an old Etonian Prime Minister since Alec Douglas-Home in 1964, although David Cameron himself says he's middle class. You may have heard, well, if we redefine middle class, which means you're related to the Queen, you can trace your line back to William IV, you went to Eton and joined the Bullingdon Club, you can buy a £1 million plus house without a mortgage in North Kensington, and you marry an heiress who's worth about £30 million. Class is the great divide that we don't discuss. There's almost a conspiracy of silence about it. It's about deep-seated inequality. It affects your life chances. We discuss racism, we discuss sexism, but we don't discuss class. Partly that's because the media is dominated by people who are well paid, very often, certainly in the upper reaches, privately educated, and private education is the way of, or one of the main ways of classes re-establishing themselves and regenerating and going on. Of course, classes are, there is some flexibility. It's not a caste system. You can point to Alan Sugar, who's a great success of making money, if you like that sort of thing. But the truth is, your occupation, your parents' occupation, will almost certainly decide your own occupation. And yes, there are movements between classes, and you get some success stories. The changes in the economy, the big expansion in white-collar middle management jobs is over. So it seems that we're more frozen now than we were. But David Cameron, well, Nicholas Soames, who's a fellow old Etonian, was overheard in the House of Commons where I work. Was overheard by one of my snouts saying that when David Cameron was elected leader of the Conservative Party, that the natural order was reasserting itself. I'd suggest the natural order never went away. And class isn't about whether you have lunch or dinner at noon, whether you have a sitting room or a living room, whether you go to the toilet or the lavatory. It is about your income, your occupation, and your life chances. But it's amazing how it's pervasive in culture. I was watching on Gold, so I've got satellite TV now. I was watching Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads, and you have Terry Collier and Bob with one social climbing, the other left behind. If you watch Downton Abbey, if that's your thing, you'll see a great discussion of class. It's amazing how the servants all seem to be rather happy with a few complaints. And on the 50th anniversary of the great trial for Lady Chatterley's lover, is it a book you'd wish your wife or your servants to read? Well, we'd frame the debate slightly differently now if we had the debate, but there is class is here. It's never gone away. And so are we still a classless society, Mr. Cameron? No, we're not, but we never have been.
Kevin just said, and I wrote it down, your parents' occupation and cinema and television output is besotted with class. I think our intellectuals are besotted with class. The only films this country seems to make are either films about Edwardian aristocrats in country houses or films about plucky working class people fighting Thatcher in the mines or the steelworks of the 1980s. About 30 years ago, Peter Bauer, the economist at the LSE, put out a pamphlet called Class on the Brain, where he said the problem with this country isn't that we're peculiarly class divided, it's that we're besotted with the idea that we're class divided. And I think that what Bauer said then was true, and it's true now. The problem is that our politicians and indeed our journalists and media people are beginning to believe this as well. We've had 3 reports on social mobility in the last 3 years from the fag end of the last Labour government. All of them saying that we lack opportunity. Your parents' occupation will almost determine your own occupation. The Milburn report, Milburn said, birth, not worth, has become more and more a determinant of people's life chances. Milburn said, we live in a closed-shop society. The Tories put out a report just before the last election on social mobility, which said social mobility has ground to a halt. None of this is true. If you divide this population of this country into 3 broad social classes, sort of professional managerial people at the top, manual workers at the bottom, and a sort of intermediate stratum in between, and look at movement between them, you find that more than half of us are in a different social class from the one we were born into. That about 40% of the kids born to professional managerial parents fail to get into the professional managerial class themselves. They are downwardly mobile. About 4 in 10 of the children born to unskilled manual workers move up out of the manual working class. We live in a remarkably fluid and open society. It's just that we don't like the idea that we do. And that's the problem that we have in this country. There is a class division in this country. The real class division in this country isn't this preoccupation with the fact that Cameron went to Eton. The class division isn't between Eton and the rest. The class division is actually at the other end of the social spectrum. I live in Hastings. I've lived in Hastings for the last 2 years. The class division in this country is between the middle mass, the great bulk of the population, which is basically getting by, some better than others, but we're basically all doing okay. And a substratum at the bottom, which has got real serious problems. And that's where we ought to be putting our attention, not on Eton and Harrow.
I think since the end of empire, class has become the new white man's burden, basically. Now that the British middle class don't have colonies where they can go and civilise the noble savages over there, they've brought that self-righteous sense of mission to this country. The working class in Britain are basically seen through a prism of either scum or victims. They're not given any credit for being very tenacious, creative, independent, free-thinking individuals. And I think the left and the right are both equally guilty of condescension and contempt towards the working classes in Britain. Take, for example, something like binge drinking. The working classes are despised for, getting trashed and vomiting in public spaces. Middle-class kids do it just as much, but they do it in out-of-town theme parks called university campuses. And also when it comes to things like that rubbish statement about broken Britain, which the Tories were coming out with last year, I find it a bit rich when men who outsource all of their parental responsibilities to nannies, au pairs and public schools start to lecture everybody else about what it takes to be a good parent. This is a fluid society. I can't sit here and say that, class has been a great millstone around my neck. I'm from a very working class family. My parents had left school in their mid-teens with no qualifications. All of my siblings and myself went to university. So did many of my peers, many of the kids I grew up with. To say that it's this great monolith is basically a lie. But this country does have a very strange neurosis with class, especially the middle classes, because they're neither poor nor rich. They will never be rich, they sort of know that. So what they do is they decide to colonise the working classes. In my lifetime, I have seen several passionate working class movements be taken over by the middle classes. It was punk, rave, football, and finally, and most sadly, of all, the Labour Party. So the neurosis that the middle classes have is to consistently squeeze the working classes out of their own cultural space and impose their values on them, while at the same time really admiring them and wanting to be like them and wanting to have some of their salty authenticity. But that hypocrisy always raises its head. The working classes are fat, they eat rubbish food, but at the same time we all love curvaceous Nigella Lawson and want to copy her high-calorie, high-cholesterol recipes as much as we can.
The question of whether we live in a classless society does raise the question of what actually social class means, because objectively class refers to your economic position, to the way that society is organised, and this is reproduced spontaneously, again, through the production process. So objectively, in that kind of narrow sociological context, class does exist, but that in itself doesn't explain why for 150 years social class was a source of tension and it was a source of controversy as well. I think there's more to class than just your occupation. It also recognised distinct interests in society as well. The phrase "to be class conscious" recognised that society was not organised in your own interests and you wanted to do something about that. Equally, for those of you who benefited from the way that society was organised, they had a distinct awareness that they needed to maintain the class system at all costs as well. So I would kind of define a class society as well as the basis of trying to justify and legitimise political and social inequalities. So this does kind of raise the question today as to whether we have the situation at the moment of the return of class, or are we a classless society? When Cameron came to power back in May, the Labour Party were already trying to discredit Cameron, the Conservative Party, by saying this is a return to old Etonian values, this is a return to Eton, Harrow, Oxbridge elites and so forth. But that's quite a crass and wrong-headed reading of what social class actually means, because historically social class was also about a contestation of the way that society was organised, and it was also about a defence of the way that society was organised as well. And clearly this is not the case today. I wouldn't say that we live in a classless society, but what we do have is class stasis. And what I mean by that is that traditionally the working class and also the old ruling elites have vacated the arenas of political power. Neither class are imposing their will on society, and neither class are imposing their interests on society. And instead, the way that class is understood is about behaviour or responses to behaviour, particularly from the middle classes. So yes, the middle classes complain about binge drinking working class chavs on a weekend, but they'll also complain about irresponsible bankers as well. So the way that class is understood now is very much that it's all about individual behaviour, and this is why social issues are also seen in a very individuated way. So do we live in a class society? Yes, we do, objectively, but not in the framework of the previous century, where class meant a political standpoint, it meant a desire to change society, or even defend the way that society is run. And instead, we have the middle classes kind of occupying a middle ground, whereby their preoccupations on individual behaviour has redefined what class means.
That there is a huge amount of inequality in our society. People are taking massive financial hits now through childcare, pay freezes, all that kind of thing. So actually, do we need some kind of re-establishment going on? I'm not sure if any of you want to start coming back on those points.
Well, I'd be all in favour of re-establishment of class interests because it would certainly re-energise politics. But preferably, if there was a re-energising of a certain class interest, it wasn't done in the old framework of previously. I mean, the speaker before me said that the Labour Party became a middle class party, but it was always a middle class party to start off with, and it was never in the interest of the working class. So if class interests were reasserted, I'd like to see them on a very different framework than the previous century in terms of more independent view of the working class. But in 2010, it is very difficult to imagine how that could happen. I would support it all the way, but it's difficult to kind of conceptualise the sense of agency at the moment.
I think the old framework of class was a horrible one. I don't like it. I don't think you'll ever get that class framework. The old people forget actually how the labour movement was very sort of anti-women and anti-immigrants in the workplace. People forget that, and they forget that it was a sort of a liberal intellectual movement that engaging with the labour movement that managed to make it more progressive in that sense. And the notion that the Labour Party is being very middle class, or that joining politics at the top end, as David Cameron has done, proves that you care about poor people. Well, no, it doesn't prove anything. If David Cameron had used his Eton and Oxford education and decided to become a primary school teacher or work in an inner city estate, I might think that he does care. I think there must be at least 1,000 to 1 ratio between public school kids who go and work in the corporate sector and those who go and work at the deliveries end of public service. You go into politics, you get power, you get status, you get fame. You don't get that as a school teacher.
What you do get as a school teacher is remarkable job security. I think about 3 teachers have been sacked in the last 20 years for incompetence. You get, like all public sector workers, and there's a point behind this comment which I'll come to in a second, you get a stunning pension scheme, which most people in the private sector would give their left arm for. You get, as a public sector worker nowadays, your average income is higher than if you're a private sector worker. It always used to be said that the pensions and so on, the job security was a trade-off against low pay. Not true anymore. Public sector workers paid more. You'll probably almost certainly be in a trade union. The trade union strength nowadays is all in the public sector. And the point behind this comment is that if you're looking for a real battle line in modern British society, it's not the mythical battle line between Eton boys and comprehensive school kids. The real battle line that's being drawn in this country is between private sector and public sector. It's a division, it's a vertical division, particularly within the middle class, between professional people in the public sector who are going to use state power through the leverage of trade unions to try and maintain their privileges, against private sector people who have to expose themselves to the disciplines of the marketplace and supply and demand. That's where the division is.
Bloody selfish teachers, educating our kids, then wanting a decent pension. Where's the world going to come to? But come on, let's not kid ourselves on class. If you look at Westminster and MPs, nearly 40% are privately educated, coming from certain groups in society. 7% of the population as a whole is privately educated. Total goes up to 54% of Conservative MPs are privately educated. They know what they're doing, and they're following their the interests of the people with them. And one of the things that annoyed me in the media was the whole discussion of housing benefit and what's it going to do to some of the poorer people in society. who'd really be on their uppers without benefits. Didn't really take off until all of a sudden George Osborne decided to attack child benefit for the 44 grand plus brigade, seemingly forgetting that just about everybody who works in a national newspaper is probably on that, and they're going to lose some money, and all of a sudden the media became interested in benefit cuts. But should we have a debate? Of course we should have a debate, and we need a debate, and we need it. Do we need it around class, or do we need it around inequality? I think we need to have it around inequality or equality or fairness and social justice, however you want to describe it. We very rarely have that debate, and certainly with the current coalition, it's very interesting. They always say, look, it's unfair that people on low incomes should pay the child benefit of the 44 plus grand a year debate. Then they say it's very unfair those on low incomes who work pay housing benefit. They always focus on trying to get neighbour against neighbour in communities. And you didn't hear a peep out of the main political class over the fact that there was a report published this week that now shows the average FTSE 100 chief executive got a 55% rise and is paid, I won't say earned, is paid £4.9 million. You didn't hear anything about that. It's trying to turn people on neighbour rather than look at the bigger picture, which you talk about the inequality between the public and the private sector. We could always pick a few examples in the public sector of people who are paid too much, and personally I don't understand how anyone, the couple of hundred who are paid more than the Prime Minister, get paid that. But just look at the private sector and the way it's let rip at the top. That's the real inequality.
I work for a county council, and I've had a long history of involvement with trade unions. Trade union movement is on its knees. Its membership might be slightly growing because of the recession and the downturn. But in terms of political activity, there's no activity. It is dead, believe me. So that's not where working class interests will be developed. We do need somewhere new for that to develop. But I'm also really concerned that what we end up with is focusing on lifestyles or focusing on pay. And there's something more fundamental that we need to have to tackle together, is that when people aspire for more material wealth or a better salary, better working conditions, better universal sort of resources, they feel really anxious that they even do that. It's almost that they're sort of either criminalised or pathologised as being either greedy or morally wanting. And that seems to me to be the problem, because before there was never attack on that. There was an aspiration for more, and continually through the elites and the press we're almost expected to want less.
I think that the divides between classes will become even more apparent, like especially with things happening like increase in university tuition and things like that. And I think that that's going to deter a lot of people from working class from wanting to go to university and try and perhaps move up from social classes and aspire for better and want better things in their life, and even things like funding for young mothers to go and study and try and get jobs and provide for their children and make better of their lives, and not being able to afford to put their children in nursery and things like that. That's stopping people from moving up, that's stopping them from aspiring and wanting better and getting better in their lives. And that's what will make the classes separate and the divide become even more apparent.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Neil Davenport. I think you took sort of a bit of an easy route in just saying that we need to reassert class but not really knowing how to do that. And I'd like to ask if you think that there were any problems with using class as an analytical tool which might shed light on the current situation that we're in.
Just in response, first of all, whether I was taking the easy way out in terms of just reasserting class interest. It wasn't so much that. There was a specific question, would you defend class reasserting itself? And yes, I would defend self-interest or self-interested action in society. Short term, it would energise politics, but at the same time, that is not where the battle lines are drawn, and I wouldn't suggest they are for a minute. I don't want to give the impression I'm just waiting for the uprising to emerge at some point in the future. The kind of boom and bust class struggle cycle. That's not what I'm getting at all. I think where the battle lines are drawn today is actually, it does transcend our traditional notions of class, and they're on two issues. The first one's on civil liberties, and the second one is on, as the speaker at the back rightly pointed out, is on material self-interest as well, or is kind of wanting more. Because I think what's tending to happen is that the issue of civil liberties, it appears to be targeting the lower classes, but it ends up being generalised across the whole of society. Likewise, millionaire football players get criticised for wanting more, but so do London Underground tube workers as well. So the old kind of class struggle in that sense, and the demarcation of class on its classical, relationship to the means of production model, has changed, because it's the middle classes that call the shots in terms of the agenda of politics, and that is the problem, and that's where the problem is. So the battle lines for me is over civil liberties and also kind of material interests as well. On your point as to whether class is a useful or a useless category, somebody said to me, Neil, you seem to be obsessed about class. Well, that's because I'm obsessed about politics. But unfortunately, with the diminishing of class as a proper subjective force in society, we've had the end of politics as well. So I still think it's a useful tool, so long as you actually get the measurement of it right. So a writer a couple of years ago argued that the class struggle will re-emerge because the working classes have expanded in numbers globally, but that completely ignores the idea of subjectivity. And so class only has any meaning when the two major classes are really kind of fighting for something and fighting to assert their interests. So, as said in the opening speech, it's not so much a classless society, but a class stasis, where there's a paralysis of the two major classes and a paralysis of politics as a result.
Okay, thanks.
I think the most glaring example of how class has asserted itself at this moment is we're talking about cuts, and we're talking about bringing down the debt. But what's interesting is with this national deficit, the notion of taxation has been completely left out of the dialogue completely. We're only talking about cuts on public services. So therefore, it's the jobs and the services that ordinary people rely on are disappearing, while those people, who are actually going to implement these cuts, neither work in the public sector nor really use these services. They use private healthcare. Or are perfectly capable of using private healthcare if they're forced to do so. If the NHS were degraded by David Cameron, he wouldn't be having his kids treated in it, that's for sure. They don't use state schools, they use public schools. They use their own private security in their houses as well. They don't have to worry about the cops, about having too many cops on the street, because they've got several grand's worth of security installed in their houses. And it's interesting that's not been brought into the public conversation at all, not even by the Labour Party, which just shows what a completely middle class and even upper middle class movement the Labour Party is now, because it refuses to talk about taking wealth from the top in order to help the people below. And in fact, the people who are going to be squeezed now with this sort of new conversation about fairness, which is rubbish, because when David Cameron says we're in it together, I look at him and says, well, well, you're not, mate. You're not in this at all. It's the middle classes who are going to be squeezed, because the working classes, they don't want to hurt them too much, because A, that makes them look bad, B, they might kick off. But the middle classes are very pliant. And all they'll do is basically harumph, write letters to The Guardian, and have embittered conversations at their desks at the office. They're not going to do anything more than that. So you can take away the child benefit and start squeezing them in other areas, when really the conversation should be taxing the people who've got lots of money in order to maintain the services that we already have.
Class is essentially about life chances. And the reason that I said in my opening comments that the real, the most serious class division that we would be focusing on is the one right at the bottom of the society, is that in our modern society, even in recession, in this affluent, incredibly buoyant capitalist economy, most people are doing okay. Certainly compared with your parents and your grandparents, you're doing phenomenally well. But there's a group at the bottom, I'd estimate probably about 5%, who I think are dropping off the bottom. And there's all sorts of indicators of it. There's indicators in terms of social pathologies about alcohol and drug abuse and so on. There's indicators about joblessness. There's indicators about how their kids are doing in school, which is atrociously badly. There's indicators about family breakdown. All these multiple deprivation indicators, we're all familiar with them, and they're concentrated in this bottom 5%. They're the group that really worry me, and I think that the rest of it is just froth on the top of the beer. But if I can also respond to the first 2 points that were made about aspirations, because what worries me about this country and the preoccupation of the intellectuals in this country with class and Cameron and the upper classes and the aristocracy and Eton and all the rest of it is the mess, and those 3 reports that I mentioned from the last Labour government saying that this is a country that has no opportunity, and the report from the Tory party saying social mobility is ground to a halt, is that if you're a kid who hasn't got an awful lot going for you in the starting out in life, well, one thing you want to hear is, get stuck in, it's possible to do well for yourself. When my father left school before the war, he was working class boy, he left school at the age of 14, and he had an autograph book, and he got his teacher to write in his autograph book, and the teacher wrote, at the age of 14, leaving school in the 1930s, aim high, for though you may not reach the sky, you will most certainly reach the mountaintops. That was the message that went out to working class kids in 1930. The message that goes out to working class kids today is, you live in a miserable, mean, horrible, class-divided society, you're not going to get anywhere, you might as well give up. And then we wonder why we've got all these social problems.
But just to push you on that, I mean, class is about inequality and the aspiration to have more. I don't really think that you have to be in the bottom 5% of society to want more than you do. A lot of apparently middle-class people live in two-bedroom houses, not enough space, kids in rubbish schools. I mean, what I'm getting at is this just about numbers, i.e. you've said there's a bottom 5%, or is it about the aspiration to have more, which a lot of people do, that you would consider to be middle class?
People will always have an aspiration to have more. If you ask people in surveys, how much more do you need to be happy? How much more do you think you need in order to be comfortable? People will always, no matter where they are in the income order, they'll always say, I need another 10, 20% and I'll be fine. And of course, they've got another 10, comparing themselves to where they were 20 years ago, they've already got the other 10 or 20%, but they're always going to want another 10 or 20%. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, aspiration is what drives social change. It's what drives improvement and progress. I mean, let's have more of that. The problem I've got is, is there a group in the society where that is unrealistic to have that aspiration? And I think there is a group, and I think it's drawn at about the 95th percentile. It's not drawn between those who go to Eton and those who go to a comprehensive. Of course, we're not all equal. Of course, we're not a flat society. Of course, not everybody has exactly the same chance. But by and large, we live in a country, apart from those kids coming out of those bottom, what I would call underclass households, for the great middle mass of this population, if you're reasonably bright and you're reasonably motivated, then you're going to do quite well in this society. That's what the evidence, it's not my opinion, that's what the evidence shows you. All the social mobility research that's been done over the last 30 years in this country tells you that. It's just that nobody wants to look at it. They prefer to listen to Milburn saying, we live in a no opportunity society. It's just not true.
I think...
Look, life isn't fair, it's not equal. It's not as if everybody starts on a 100 metres dash on the same point. Some people start at the back with lead boots, and others have got the best Nike trainers, 10 metres from the finishing line. You can have as many aspirations as you like, but if you're coming from the wrong side of the tracks, I'm afraid you're not going to get into Oxford. You're not going to get into Cambridge. That is why they're dominated by the schools. They're dominated. You look at we have a government. We have an old Etonian Prime Minister, and his deputy came from Westminster. The two most expensive. You need 29 grand to get into these. I'm sorry, not everybody has 29 grand to spare when the median wage is 24. The point on universities, the worst thing this government could possibly do is to create a market in universities whereby some universities will be able to charge far more than others. When top-up fees were brought in, it almost was everybody went up to 3 grand. Just about everybody went up to 3 grand. I think it's 3,290 now, isn't it? So you basically there wasn't a market as such. Now, if they bring in a market and some can charge 10, 11 grand, well, if you pay 29 grand to Eton or 28 grand to Westminster or whatever, you probably think your kids are getting a cheap education when they go to university. But if your median income, half people in Britain earn less than 24 grand, of course their kids are going to go to cheaper universities. You just know it'll widen that gap, and it will be a disastrous policy if they bring it in.
I think there's two things that are being conflated here, and I think one is inequality, which exists in all sorts of different countries, and I think the other one is cultural, which exists in Britain specifically. And I think that's one of the misunderstandings that's coming through here. And to me, as somebody who's day class A, but living here for 20 years, what I find fascinating is that there are these various different classes that are defined by their accent. I would say accent is the big thing for class. If somebody speaks for a paragraph, I can tell what their parents do for a living. And I've won money doing this, bizarrely. It's a possible thing. And what I find obnoxious about the British class system is that it's so impermeable, that the top classes do not allow, they treat their own sort of little cultural habits, Radio 3 and Radio 4, their own little personal property and you know, it's their own little club, and nobody else is really allowed into it. And I think that's the absolutely worst thing. On the other hand, it's also deference. That's a terrible thing that you have in this society. It's so weird for a North American, where people accept people telling them what to do because they're from an upper class. And there's all this middle class bullying of the working classes in this society that I find is one of the worst things.
The one thing I would really, again, like to push are the points that have been made about material standards. And we've talked about the need for better education, housing, and so on. But actually, is that all there is to it? Can we say that a loss of collective aspiration is to blame for the lack of mobility? There are no longer working class intellectuals. There is no longer a Labour Party that will really kind of defend working class interests. So is it all about the material?
One problem I've got with for want of a better word, I'm not going to apologise for being an old Marxist, but for want of a better word, the old kind of ruling class or the old ruling elites, the problem I've got is that they actually don't act like an old ruling class or an old ruling elite. If you look at Cameron, despite his posh background, he tries ever so hard to convince he's just one of us. He tells us what's on his iPod. He tells us that he's just kind of an ordinary, regular guy. In actual fact, what we want is an elite to actually kind of promote high standards and a high culture. Exactly what we had, let's say, in the 1960s, where there was genuine social mobility in the sense that these were the standards for everybody to aspire to. And instead you have a ruling class who are not actually getting anybody to aspire to anything apart from a generalised kind of levelling down. To respond to the point made on the panel, it's very frustrating that social class is seen as entirely subjective, that it's all in the lower classes' mind, that there's just these amazing opportunities are waiting for them. It's all part of that new Labour thinking that let's get all working class kids to have a degree and then they will lift themselves out of poverty, as if structural inequality, poor wages don't exist, and it's all in kind of people's imagination. It's just absolutely absurd. But it also reflects what I've said earlier, that class is now reinterpreted very much individuated, or it's reinterpreted on an individual level, in the sense that class equals problematic individual behaviour. So previously, class was interpreted as a threat to people's position in society. Now it's a threat to their sense of decency, or it's a threat to what is seen to be civilised behaviour, whether that's the lower classes or the hooray Henrys, the city boys at the top, and that's exactly how kind of class is interpreted in that particular way. And finally, we don't have upward mobility. It's an absolute myth. I mean, Tony Judd, the late great historian, in his sterling post-war book, delivered a very angry polemic against this notion, which said that the British working class are the most exploited in Europe, with absolutely appalling poverty outside of the metropolis, and the idea that there is upward mobility is absolutely absurd.
I enjoyed the little conflagration between Peter and Kevin, and I thought that they were both right. And both wrong as well. Aspiration's massively important. I mean, I know too many people who are from poor immigrant backgrounds who are doing way better than their parents were. I just know too many of them. I think a big part of that is actually because we came in outside the class narrative that pre-existed our arrival here in the first place. So we didn't have a lot of the baggage, the sense of disloyalty that I've always seen amongst white working class kids. Where if to aspire beyond your peers was somehow to show disloyalty to them, or to show some contempt towards them, and how their peers would feel rejection. I didn't suffer that, but I saw that sense of solidarity. But also, Kevin's thing about this middle class thing of Oxford and Cambridge, like this. I remember seeing a Guardian double-page spread, how can we get more working class kids into Oxford and Cambridge? Because that's really what the working classes are obsessing about every day. Is that whether they can get 600 or 700 of their kids a year into Oxford or Cambridge is rubbish. It's like when Tony Blair was banging on about education. Again and again, it's kind of like the middle classes have a thing with the working classes, like you've got to be like us, otherwise you won't ever be happy. But they're constantly sort of worried about themselves anyway. Sometimes very petty argument that keeps taking place about class that doesn't value that wants to polarise it into sort of hereditary class thing or an aspirational thing, when it's a mixture of the two and you've got to find a middle road.
Sorry to bore you with evidence. Yeah, the idea that we have upward mobility is completely absurd, says a sociologist who must know the sociological literature. 40% of children born to the professional classes fail to get into the professional class. That's downward. That's the failure of the professional classes to hold on to their class privileges. A third of the kids who make it to the service class have come out of the manual working class. Apparently this is complete myth. All this data is complete myth. This data is produced mainly by left-wing sociologists. It's very difficult to find any other kind of sociologist in this country. Left-wing sociologists produce this data, which apparently is complete myth. To talk about an enduring class system, you have to hold to this myth that classes reproduce themselves. If confronted with evidence that actually classes are remarkably bad at reproducing themselves, that it is not true, as Kevin said at the start, that tell me your father's occupation and I'll tell you yours, it's just not true. The question of, which was interesting, about why then is this country so preoccupied with class, I think has to do with the symbolism of the fact that the importance still in our culture of monarchy and aristocracy and the House of Lords and all that stuff. That at the very top of our society there is this froth, which symbolically is very important in informing us of the kind of society we live in. It is not true that we can all become the next King or Queen of England. It is not true that the House of Lords is a meritocratic institution. And therefore we extrapolate from that to assume that the whole class structure is like that. And that's why we're so fond of Edwardian dramas and this thing that's going out on Sunday night and so on, because it reaffirms that. But actually, below that top 1%, as I say, we've got a middle mass, but basically there's an awful lot of interchange between different positions. I, of course, accept, Kevin, that we don't all start at the same point, unless you're going to have compulsory state nurseries with children taken away compulsorily from their parents at birth and stuck in a state nursery, so they all start on the same starting line. You are never going to get to a point where all kids are starting at exactly the same point. Realistically, what we've got to aim for is a society which is broadly meritocratic, which means if you're fairly bright and if you're fairly motivated, there's nothing that's going to stop you doing quite well in the society, and that is the society that we live in today.
I'll get rid of my point of agreement with Peter out of the way first, and that is, I suspect we may talk in terms of class here because we do have a hereditary monarchy and we have old dukes and all that nonsense that we kind of put up, and that's why we may see it slightly differently to the way that you do in the United States. However, let's not kid ourselves. In the United States, there are great inequalities, and in fact, it's more economically unequal than Britain is, and the underclass is bigger, and they're dumped and they're warehoused in projects, and they're absolutely stuck there. But on this whole question of aspirations, there's a lot of aspirations around. I don't just mean people entering X Factor on a Saturday night and wanting to get out that way. But it is harder if you come from a parent and their manual occupation. I tell you, it'll be harder to get on life. And yes, people do. To actually make more money, to be more successful, to have more life chances, to bloody live longer, for God's sake. You know, people who come from wealthy backgrounds are living nearly 10 years longer on average than those who come from manual workers, which I always think when you listen to the public debate and Ian Duncan Smith says, let's raise the pension age to 66. Well, it's all right, I'm sure, for Ian Duncan Smith and his background. He'll have a nice, long, happy retirement, but there's a lot of other people are going to lose a fair chunk of their retirement of it. If we were a broadly meritocratic society, I'd be all for it, but to be broadly meritocratic, you're going to have to help some people a lot to start, because others are maybe not quite born with a silver spoon in their mouth, but they're born with a huge advantage, which is why they tend to do well and other people don't. You can be as bright and you can be as hard-working and as aspirational and hopeful as you like, but you will find life is tougher, and it's where you're born.
Okay, can we thank our panel, please?